So first of all, I want to say thanks to Kay for letting me speak here and inviting me to speak. And also, I wanted to say that I think the work you do here at Common History is fantastic. You're just such an active history group, and for us starting out in this project, we found you completely invaluable. So thanks for your really great website. As Kay said, so my name's Dr. Yvonne McFadden, and I'm a researcher on this project, the Lost Villages of East Ayrshire. I'm based at the Scottish Oral History Centre, and that's at the University of Strathclyde. So I'll just take you through what I'm going to go through today, tonight even. So what I'm going to talk about is tonight is going to be more focused on kind of like the project, what we're up to, what we're finding out, and just a kind of snippet of some of the ways, some of the things we're finding out and how we're perhaps thinking we're going to use what we find. So I'm going to start with the project, talk a little teeny bit about oral history, a little bit of background, and then move on to finding the stories and play some audio clips as well. So I'll just move that along. So just to say a bit about the project, so our funders, as Kay said, we're part of the Coalfield Communities Landscape Partnership, which is operating in the area, mainly run by East Ayrshire Council. We're also funded by Historic Environment Scotland and the Heritage Lottery Fund as well. As Kay said, the partnership is quite big. I think it's about 20 odd projects are running in the area, lots of interesting stuff going on. There's the project at Lugar Heritage Centre. There's the Doon Valley Railways involved. We've also got some ideas about, I think there's a mountain bike course or something they're trying to make, and rewilding, a lot of eco stuff going on. They're going to rewild, they're going to restore peatlands, stuff like that. So really doing some interesting things in the project, and we're part of that as well. We are the oral history elements with the heritage section, similar to Kay, your project, ploughing up our past. So on the team is it's led by Professor Arthur McIver. So he's the director of the Scottish Oral History Centre, and he specialises in the history of work and the body. So he looks a lot at health. Got a book on miners' lungs, so he's quite well versed in the history of mining in the 20th century. And he also has an interest on deindustrialisation and its impacts on people and communities, and particularly on gender as well. So that's kind of what he's bringing to the project. So I'm the research associate. So basically, I'm a historian of gender and home. That's my kind of area of interest. So I'm really interested in community histories. I'm interested in men and women and kind of how they experience home and how work is experienced within the home, but also how that relates to paid work outside the home as well. So that's what I bring to the project as well. So we're based, as I said, at Strathclyde. So our villages. So the villages that we're focusing on is Levenhill, Burnfoot Hill and Benquat in the Doon Valley. And then in the Lugar Valley is Common Dyke and Duncorner. And then also we're right on the edge of Ayrshire, barely Ayrshire, nearly Lanarkshire. We're looking at Glenbuck as well. So these villages were chosen for us. We kind of inherited them. And we may make a case later at a later date to expand the villages we look at, as indeed there are so many, as many you'll know from Dane Love's book, The Lost Villages of Ayrshire, which is a well-researched and thorough examination of these villages. So Glenbuck, as I say, it's on the edge of Ayrshire. It had an ironworks from the 18th century, and this picture here is actually of Glenbuck, the Grass Hill Miners' Row. So the main pit, the Grass Hill pit, closed in 1933, and by 1954 it was depopulated under the kind of housing policy that was going on in the interwar period. And then Levenhill and Burnfoot Hill. So the more I've been talking to people, I found out it's mainly just they're both referred to together as the hill. So it grew to be quite a large settlement with about 300 houses eventually by the end of the century. And again, similar to Glenbuck, they depopulated about 1954 as well. And then Common Dyke we know that just after the war, the Second World War was finishing, there were still people there, but by the end of the Second World War, they were all kind of mostly gone. And also, Common Dyke had a station that was on the Muirkirk line. And we've been given some lovely photos of the railway by one of our volunteers as well. And Darnconnor, we know that has the longest row, the common row, which had 96 houses. And as the employment with all these villages, as employment, basically the pit started to close in the 1920s, 1930s, and you get people leaving and the population's going down because there's no work. So people are having to go elsewhere for works. And Darnconnor's similar, start rehousing in the 1930s, and until the outbreak of war kind of disrupts the process, and then eventually after the war, the village is empty. So these are our villages, and we've been kind of finding out as much as we can about them to get us kind of started. But obviously, we want to find out more than just, you know, the villages were there and the people left. We're looking for like to make meaning of it, I suppose, might be a good way to think about it. So the project as a whole, main objective is the oral testimony. So that's our main, like, kind of what we're up to. So we want to create an archive, and that's going to be locally archived with the Ayrshire Archives. They haven't confirmed which building yet. They'll also be archived at the university so that students can use it as well. So what we've been doing, so we just started off in March, so we're relatively new and up and running. We're doing a survey of the existing materials. So we've been looking for oral histories that already exist. We've found a couple that particularly to do with our villages. We've been seeing what books are out there, and also been looking at autobiographies. We've also spent a long time looking at the National Library of Scotland Maps website, trying to figure out, you know, where they are and what the villages kind of looked like. And we've been gathering photographs as well, and people have started donating photos to us. So our next steps as well, we want to have a rummage through the newspapers, and also we will do some archival research, probably looking at the council archives and perhaps looking at central government as well to see how it all fits into the depopulation narrative. So one of the key things that we're doing is we are recruiting volunteers in the area. We really want to involve the local community because the local community's knowledge is basically invaluable in a project like this. The people we've spoke to so far, you know, they know lots about, they have lots of family connections, they've told us things about the villages, they know people already. Our volunteers are saying, I'm going to interview my neighbour, I'm going to interview so-and-so. So these are kind of like essential, I think, for a project like this. And also when we do public history or oral history, I'm a real big fan of, you know, people should interview each other kind of in the community or the population that you're studying. So they're bringing lots of the project. A lot of them are family historians, and they are experts at finding out all about people and using all these different sources. And I think what's a wee bit different for them is they're used to going back, seeing how far back they can go, whereas we're trying to root them in the mid-20th. We're working with living memory, which is a little bit different. So we have a batch of oral history interviewers that we just recently trained up. So they're good and ready to go. So we're about to start really like the first interviewing phase of the project. We've been doing a couple here and there. Another key thing that volunteers or contributors are doing is they're donating pictures, they're donating books, they're donating memoirs. We've had an autobiography donated. We've had 2 autobiographies donated. We've also had someone type up their memoirs and donate them to us. So people have been really kind. People are really interested in the project. I've had good responses on Facebook. So yeah, so we're looking for any way we can to involve the local community. So I just want to say a little bit about oral history. So oral history comes from traditions such as folklore, such as kind of spoken histories that are handed down through generations. It's been more, I suppose, like formalised into a methodology. So we're not just interested in what people are saying, we're also interested in kind of how they say it and why they say it as well. Where oral history has really come to the fore in terms of history as a subject is looking at marginalised groups or communities. So in the UK, it really started in the US with the African American communities recording their own histories, creating a history that doesn't exist. And in the UK, it's been used really well for working class histories. So there's a lot of working class histories. We call it history from below, which takes it away from the elite kind of top, governments and, the managers basically, and looking down and actually seeing what people views were from the bottom up basically. But another area that it's really come to the fore is women's studies as well. So looking at the domestic sphere, looking at feminist history as well, and then also BAME groups here as well. There's some good projects on the go, such as Colourful Heritage, looking at the Southeast Asian community in Glasgow. And also I was part of a project called Speaking Out, which looked at Scottish Women's Aid and made an oral history of the Scottish Women's Aid organisation. So oral history has that, I suppose, that power to uncover these voices that are missing from history, the voices of the everyday, the voices of the marginalised, and that's like really its strength. So I've got this quote here from Professor Abrams, and she says, oral history is the act of recording speech of people with something interesting to say and then analysing their memories of the past. And that's really quite simply, in a nutshell, what oral history is. So why is that a good fit for our project? So we want to reconstruct this everyday life in the miner's role. So that's what we're looking at. So I suppose, in a sense, the archival work that's been done to date is complementary to what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to find those hidden histories, and particularly what's emerging from the oral testimony is women's lives in the mining communities. Every interview I've read or had, I just did one today actually, people emphasise like the work that women had to do living particularly in those miners' rows. So it's a relationship between home and work is something that's quite hard to kind of get at through conventional sources, and that's where oral history comes into the fore. So really what we're trying to create is a social and cultural history of the miners' rows. So we're looking for stories, we're thinking about social life, we're thinking about how do people spend their time, what did they do together as a community, what were the routines of the community, or what were the routines of the people, how did they live their life. And what we try to say is it's about meaning making. So it's about, what do these events mean in people's lives? What does it mean? We know the villages closed or were depopulated in 1954, but what did that mean to people to have to move out that village in 1954 and go and live in a different community? So it's about saying, we know the kind of ins and outs of it, but let's try and find out more about kind of the stories behind it, I suppose might be a good way to think of it. And with that in mind, we're also part of kind of making meaning of the villages, as well as like we're looking at intergenerational history. So we're wanting to talk to people who had families who lived in the mines, the miners' rows, and have them talk about the memories of their gran, their mum. So basically stories in the family that kind of, I suppose, build your identity as a family, like connect you to the heritage and to the past. So just a little bit of background before I start giving some examples that we found from our survey of the materials that we found to date. So as many of you know, there's rich coal fields in the Ayrshire area. The mining companies built workers' houses from the mid-1840s all across Scotland, not just in Ayrshire, and that was so the workers could be housed closer to the pits to do the work. The villages of Leathenhill, Burnfoot and Benquat, they were the Dam Millington Company, the ironworks at Waterside, and Dunconnor and Common Dyke were William Baird and Company. These two companies eventually merged to become Baird and Dalmellington Company in 1931, and it's estimated they controlled 70% of the Ayrshire coalfield, so that's some monopoly they had going on eventually. So I put this, I owe my soul to the company store, because today in an interview, a woman just quoted it at me, because that's some of the stories that quite emerged from this book, The Hill and Its People and Its Pits. So this is a really interesting book. So it was Thomas McFadden, and he collected stories from people he knew who'd stayed up in the hill. And it's a good testimony of life in a company village. For example, we can find out that, that the company owned the road until a public road was built in 1921. In fact, someone I interviewed recently said that his family eventually moved down to the Gatehouse, which, although by that point there was a public road and the public road was in operation, but he still had to operate the gate to let the farmers and so forth up the company road. So that was quite interesting. But when it was gated, his books, particularly useful because it goes back quite far in living memory that we couldn't go back to now because it's just, it's too late, it's 2021. So the gated road is quite interesting though, because it makes it hard to leave. So there's stories of people, if you wanted to do a flip, sometimes you had to do it through the night. Because you had to basically, there was only one road up and down. You had to either leave all your stuff or make sure you weren't in debt at the company, at the company store. So it was kind of stop the goods coming in, and also they controlled the goods coming in and out. So one of the interviews we found talks about that, talks about how the company, blocked the road, and it was hard. They had chains across the road, and it was hard to get other vans up to supply the villages. So that's two stories where I found that. There was also a story in this book that was quite interesting. That was about the story of the watchman. So basically, it would report any children that went into the field, and if they were in the field, the company would actually dock their parents' wages. So they would take a note of the children, and obviously in the small village, they knew who it was, and they would actually dock their wages. So it's quite interesting. So this is a thread that's coming up in the oral testimony as well. This idea that you get your money, and then the company owned the beer store. So your beer money's going to the company. They have the main store which supplies the food. So you're buying your food from the company. So really, what's in your pocket. So so this woman today I was interviewing, this is what she said to me. She said, I owe my soul to the company store. So that's been quite interesting. So that's one of the things that I've found having a kind of scout about, and something that will emerge, I think, as we go through the project. I think most of you will be probably familiar with this, the Ayrshire Miners' Rose 1913 report. So this was a report by two officials for the Ayrshire Miners' Union, Thomas McKerrow and James Brown. So this report is quite detailed. It's an excellent document, and it was a really thorough survey. They have really great methodology, I think, in the way they report it and how accessible they make the report for the person having to read it. I mean, it just lists village after village and the conditions. It's repetitive, but it makes such a great point in that repetitiveness. It's critical, unsurprisingly, of being from the union, of the mine companies and how they're managing or not managing, or just completely, dereliction of duty really towards the miners that live in the rows. By this point in 1813, some of the houses are 50, 60 years old and had pretty much no maintenance. Also, they have some suggestions, because this report fed into the Royal Commission on Housing, which was started before the First World War and then interrupted, and so it published in 1917, and that's available online, so you can read that if you're interested. But they also made some suggestions about, what would be a good house for a miner, so they put some new kind of plans in and so forth. So generally, the conditions of the miners' houses were pretty poor. They generally had no running water internally. Sanitation is often remarked upon, and kind of open sewers. 1 or 2 rooms with a scullery at the back was the most common kind of layout or size. And often people slept in recesses where the beds were. They were quite high up. And also, just to have a think about kind of what life was like to live in the rows, there was no pithead baths. So, you know, one man told me the story where, you know, the men would be brought in back through the scullery and stripped off of their clothes from the pit and then put straight in a bath. And all the clothes had to be washed, you know. So you get an idea already of the kind of work that might be involved in living in these houses. So I've got a quote, this is on Burnfoot Hill, and I like it because it just has all this great, like, you know, it's quite passionate. It says, many families have absolutely no washing, no wash house, no coal house, no ash pit, no closet, exclamation mark. What do the people do? This is a question which should not be asked too loudly. From time to time, one hears rumours that fever is rife here. We have only these rumours to go by, but there is certainly plenty of fever breeding grounds. And that was something they did quite cleverly in the report as well. Like, quite often they did look at the local kind of medical officer reports and kind of added that to the report to say, yes, fever's rife, and it's really unsurprising. This is the row at Burnfoot Hill, which, apologies if I'm saying it wrong, the Phoenician row. I've actually interviewed someone that lived in this row. Yeah, so that was just to give you an idea. So this, because of this mining report, we all know it's very freely available on the internet. It was reproduced in 1979 by the Ayrshire Archaeology and Natural History Society. I hope I got that right. And they, by doing that, I suppose they just kind of opened it up, I think, to a whole new audience, and also having it online makes it just anybody can read it. And we use it in university as a teaching aid as well, like as one of our topics. So yeah, so as I say, so the pits are starting to close in the 1920s and 1930s. There's a gradual decline really through the early 20th century. And that, with that, becomes basically depopulation. And so people are leaving. So the population is steadily dropping from a peak really in the 1890s. There's a steady drop in the populations. There are some improvements, like electricity does come to the hill. And I was speaking to a woman in Ben Watt today, and she was saying that they had electricity, but you could only light one light with it. And she told the story of a woman had plugged her Hoover into the light socket in the ceiling. And you can imagine it didn't go well, and all the neighbours were kind of crowding around to see if she was okay. So you get the idea. And obviously the hill had a public road built. There was buses going up to the villages. So, you know, things were improving. But as I say, the central government in the interwar period had a major programme of basically rehousing people, rehousing the slum dwellers in the cities, and also the miners' rows were a target for this as well. So they were rehoused under this policy, and the villages were decanted, is the word that we used, decanted, and it seems to be just at the outbreak of war, they're starting to move, and then the war outbreaks and it kind of interrupts the process. But by the early 1950s, most of the villages are emptied. And that's something we want to look at in this project as well, is we want to look at that process of deindustrialisation. So we want to look at that process of what happens when industry goes away and people are displaced, and what happens to community when that when they experience that, and also what happens to kind of issues around like masculinity and gender as well. So that's something we're interested in looking at. So that's a kind of idea of where the project's coming from. And the stage we're at just now is that we are still in that kind of survey stage. We've still got a big pile of books, each, Arthur and I, and we're working our way steadily through them. But we've also started doing some oral histories. But also, as I said, people have been donating stuff to us. So our first oral history, which you will hear from tonight as well, so this is Sam Purdy. So in his interview, he spoke at length about what it was like to live in the miners' rows in Glenbuck in the early 40s and 50s. He's a great narrator. He really constructs his school days, village, recreation, local characters, living conditions, and the social and cultural history of the community during the 20-year demise of the local pit. So the pit, Grass Hill, closed in 1932. And he said, when the pit died, Sam commented, it virtually tore the heart out of the village. Killing the pit killed the village, really. So Sam and his family were moved into Muirkirk, which seems to be where most of the Glenbuck residents have gone, because one of our volunteers lives in Muirkirk, and she's apparently getting a big list of people who used to live in Muirkirk given to her, so who used to live in Glenbuck, sorry, who live in Muirkirk now, that she's hoping to interview soon. When asked, how did you feel moving out of Glenbuck, he paused for a while and said, I don't think I've ever quite got over it, to be honest. We were torn out by the roots. Those were formative years. It was all we ever knew. It was a complete community. And Sam has been very instrumental in the project. He's put us in touch with quite a lot of people. He's wrote a couple of reflections as well on Glenbuck, one called Requiem for a Village. So Sam's been a really kind of, not only has he generously donated his time and his story to us, but he's also really kind of, I suppose he's a really good advocate, cheerleader for our project as well. And as I say, Sam's testimony is actually on our website as well, so if you wanted to listen. So this is an interview we earthed up from another archive. Actually the archivist at the uni found it, but it is the audio's in another archive in Edinburgh. So it was interviewed in 2000 by Ian McDougall, who is one of Scotland's foremost oral historians. He was born in 1926, which many of you might know was the year of the Great Strike. He lived in Benquot until 1939 and was later an electrician in the pits. So he's quite interesting because he grew up in the old foreman's house, which meant he had the only toilet in the village in the house. So, and also he talked at length about shopping in the village. He talking about the company vans. He called the villagers a captive population and the extreme measures of the chains across the road to stop the co-op vans kind of coming up to supply the villages. Other topics he talks about are religion, play, school life, working in the mines. He also is very good on diet. I know that sounds like maybe not something everybody's interested in, but I am. And he's very good on diet because I think it's always really interesting what people can afford to eat and how they get by, basically. And it is a very important topic, you know, and also the houses. So that was one we found. This is another one that was donated to us by Alice Wallace, who has been also interviewed for the project, and hers is called it was Ben What Then What is what she called her autobiography. So she charts her memories of growing up in the village. Her account focuses on what she calls the everyday situations and just how it was in the village during the Second World War, and I think after the Second World War. And what's really interesting about Alice's whole story is that she adds this additional layer to the story where she really emphasises kind of women's experiences, and this is based on what she can remember, but also her mum, who maintained the friendships with the women in the village even when they moved down to Bellsbank. Her mum and her friends used to meet regularly, and her mum told her all these stories as well. So she's in this autobiography. It's also a kind of memoir of her mum as well. So she's remembering a lot of the stories that her mum told her. So there's a lot of great stories about home. It's about family, relationships, and also she's quite strong on like how gendered life was, how split it was. You know, the Miners' Institute was where the men went and nobody was allowed in. You know, like women were discouraged. She said there was a bolt hole that women could go to. You weren't really supposed to go in, but if you did go in, you could sit in the bolt hole and have your drink. But I mean, the detail in Alice's stories is wonderful. Um, she talks in detail about, you know, the poverty, how thrifty her mother was, but also another thing that really comes through in Alice's story is the kind of relationship between the women in the village and a real sense of community and a really supportive network. So, for example, if a miner was ill, then obviously you wouldn't get paid, and to miss 2 days' work even when you're on quite a small margin, you know, a small budget, uh, can really can really push you into basically not being able to eat. So she was talking about how the women, if that had happened, you know, they would be scraping together what they can, making pancakes, bringing them round, whatever, you know, just to wee things to keep the family going during that hard time. So it's a really rich, really warm testimony that she's given, and also our interviews really excellent as well. So so Alice was moved to Bells Bank, where down near Dalmellington, just kind of on the hill above Dalmellington, and that's where a lot of, like, most of the people from the village were moved down to. So her mum's friends, they all lived kind of near each other in Bells Bank still, so they kind of maintained a certain amount of community when they moved. And this is a really exciting and interesting donation. So this is a Sim family. So they lived in Lethen Hill. So first of all, we got Andrew Sim's autobiography donated by his family. So he was again the same as Tom Wilson. He was born in 1926 during the general strike, and his reflections are kind of on life. It's more on his life in general, but there's some really great material about the hill. So he lived there until he was called up in 1944. So he lived there for quite some time. The family lived until 1951 when they were put down. They moved down to Patna, Doon Bank. So what's very interesting then is then we got contacted by another relative who had a tape to their mother in 1998 talking about different aspects of her life, and one of the tapes was on the topic of Lethen Hill. It turns out that this is his sister, Margaret Sim. So this is when I was just saying to Kay, so what we've done is we've cleaned that up because the tape was quite hard to listen to, and we've sent that off to the transcriber, and so we're really excited to have this kind of family. We've got this family story now that kind of knits together. So so this is the kind of stuff that people have been donating to us, which we are really grateful for. We just get really overexcited when people donate things to us and we hear more stories. So I'll move on. So here's just some of the things that we're pulling out of the testimony. So everybody, as I say, the report in 1913 talks about what the houses were like in 1913. So we're speaking to people and getting stories about what the houses are like just on the edge of the kind of the decline of the village, just before the village, they empty basically. And let's just say it's not much better, I'm afraid. So here's Andrew Sim on his childhood home in Lethen Hill. He said, contains a large room containing 2 inset beds, a separate bedroom, mainly kept for visitors, a kitchen, wash house and coal house, no WC. It was housed in a privy at the top of the garden, 25 yards away. We had a cold water supply only. All hot water had to be heated. The kettle was almost always on the stove, and it was a solid fuel coal burner. Our family were lucky. My father put in the cold water supply to prevent my family having to bring the water to the house from buckets from the spout about 25 yards up the back and back road outside the Harvey house. I had reason to keep away from the spout, and then he tells a story about how he was always going to the spout and getting soaking and stuff, and all the women were giving him into trouble. But yeah, so that gives you an idea of the house, and it was quite interesting. As soon as I read he had the cold water supply, I was like, oh, how do they have that? So his dad was a maintenance worker in the pits, and he actually, what he would do is he would actually build privies for people. So he did kind of odd jobs around the village as well. So he would go and build the wooden privies. So the wooden privies were just a wooden hut, and it had a kind of pail under it, and that had to be emptied as well. And here we have Sam. So this is about a minute. Hopefully this will work. If someone can just give me a thumbs up when I play it to let me know that it's worked. So this is Sam talking about Glenbuck?
Glenbuck itself was, being so small, it was a complete community. Everybody knew everybody else. First of all, Glenbuck was primitive. There was no electricity, there was no gas, so all cooking was done on the fire. And this huge grate formed the main hub of the living room, because miners lived in rows comprising 2 apartments, and sometimes 10 of a family in these 2 rooms. The Shankleys, for instance, there were 10 of them, and they were in one of these houses, which was 2 apartments. Eventually, they managed to acquire the house next door, so they annexed another 2 rooms. But you can imagine the living conditions. The other thing that was not, water wasn't piped into any of these houses. These houses were built in the mid-19th century by the coal owners. There was no sanitation, there was no water. Sanitation was all outside. There were no flush toilets. The toilets that were built over open middens, and that was the sewage system, which existed until 1954 when we left.
So there's Sam, who's a great narrator, eloquently telling us about what it was like basically to live in these conditions. So the conditions, as you can see, aren't much better from the 1913 miners' report, and this is, you know, not very good at mental maths, what's 20 years later, 30 years later.
Glenbuck.
And then the other topic that's coming up quite a lot is women's work. So when we're talking about the miners' village, so we're talking about the houses, and so when you live in a house that doesn't have running water, that doesn't have a toilet, that you're trying to keep a whole family in one room at all times, it creates a lot of work for women. So I've put a little bit here. This is from Alice. This is her description of the women when they were washing the blankets. She would say it was a once a year job because they were so heavy and you had to wait for a really good day. So she says it was heavy work, but it had to be fitted along with all the other work of the day. The women helped one another, usually working in pairs to get the water, taking 2 pails at a time, one in each hand. They went along to the water pumps at each end of the row. It was not as easy as turning a tap either. They had to operate the pump to get the water. Several trips of fetching and carrying were needed to have enough. So this is Alice's, in her oral testimony, which we haven't processed, or I would play for you because it's wonderful. She talks in more detail about, having to light the boiler and having to get the water hot enough. But this is wonderful illustrations that are all throughout our book as well. This is her illustration of the women helping each other to clean the blankets. And she would say that it had to be done and then they had to be dried the same day and put back in the bed because they didn't have any other blankets for the beds, because they didn't have spares, basically. And here we have Sam again, and he should be, hopefully, if it works, talking about the wash house.
Every 4 houses has got an external closet in front of the house, and then but every 6 houses had a separate wash house. Now the procedure for the wash house is there's a huge cast bowl, and the housewife whose turn it is to do the washing has to go out about 4 o'clock in the morning and light the fire. So the water in this cast iron tub is going to be hot enough to do our washing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what the weather's like. It's your turn for the washing. You've got to do it this week or you can't do it until next week. So these were communal. So you can see that this is a community of people who, for instance, in the long row, there was only one water pump. They had to go 33 houses, some of them, fill their pails with drinking water and carry it back to the house. So that was the chore, you see. And the sanitary arrangements were absolutely primitive.
So again, this Sam explaining, as you can see, they still have the spoots, and Glenn Butler was only one on the long row. So again, it's building up this picture of how much work was involved in daily life. I mean, when he says people had to, go and carry, get the pails, but really it was women who were doing all this work. In 2 interviews so far, people have told us that so women, they emptied all the kind of, they would empty the midden, the toilet, they would empty that bucket, they would empty the bucket, any potties in the house. So it was all these lists of chores that women had to do every day, and these were really kind of, I was saying, I think the women must have been really strong. They must have had arms of steel with all the carrying and lifting and scrubbing that they did every day. And so this is quite a picture of Common Dyke, taken from the Bing up the hill. And I like, if you can see, that's the wash house at the back. So these were shared. So I'm talking to the Cumnock history group, and I'm quite aware that I've got no testimony from Darnconnor or Common Dyke, which is neither your side of things. And that's because we don't have any yet. I found out, I've spoke to people, I've not interviewed anybody yet, and they were saying that collectively the area they would call themselves tapsiders, and they come from the tap side. And I know, obviously, from Dane Love's research, that the people were relocated to Auchinleck, and there was a bit of a stooshy over the rent price as well. So we don't have any testimony from Darnconnor or Common Dyke yet, but we do have some lovely pictures. This is this is from our volunteer. So this is from Rab McMurdo. He donated this, and his this is pictures of the railway. He's got another one he's gave us of the railway hut as well, which was kind of the station house. So we do have some pictures. We have more pictures of Common Dyke than we do stories yet. So some of the themes and topics we're going to be looking at. So we're going to collect all these stories, and these stories are great. But as I said in my earlier thing, we're probably going to do some analysis. So one of the areas we're looking at gender and work, particularly looking at the unpaid labour of women. That's a hidden area of life. It doesn't really it's hard to get at. It's not going to be written in a book, really. It's going to have to talk to people to find out what women did. We're also going to look at miners' work as well, and the impact of pit closures on kind of masculinity, so when saying kind of men's self-esteem and things like that. We'll want to look at health. We'll want to look and see if there's any health impacts from the housing that we can identify, and also work from either housework or already we've interviewed someone whose father had bad lungs from working in the mine and died young. And also we're interested in that power dynamic between the company and the miners. So we're looking to explore that a wee bit more. But particularly we're also seeing this as a communities history. So we want to find out about social life, support networks. We're wanting to look at deindustrialisation. It's such a big part of Scottish history in the 20th century. It's still an ongoing process today. And particularly we're interested in the intergenerational impact of pit closures. What does that mean for young people growing up, particularly young boys in the area? And also this rehousing experience, this disruption to community, this dislocation and relocation. What does that mean? And then particularly being part of the kind of physical landscape as well. So what's the role between place and memory? So these are the kind of ways that we're kind of looking at the project and what we're hoping to find. So far, we're finding some really interesting stories, and obviously the more we gather, the more we'll be able to see the kind of threads that kind of bind these stories together. So I've just got one last clip to finish. And it's from Sam, and I just thought it was funny, so I've just put it on. So here we go.
We had an instance where Arthur Woodman, Secretary of State for Scotland, the first Labour government, 45, must have been about 46, he started to think about the conditions of the miners' rows. And it was his vision that we could do away with miners' rows. So he came to Glenbock to visit, and he was visiting around the house. Now, if you can imagine the configuration of these houses, There was the front door, then there was a tiny lobby where usually the drinking water was kept,
Yep.
and a couple of pails of coal. And then there was the inside door that led into the living room.
Mm-hmm.
So Arthur was going round, and he was in this house visiting, and almost as an afterthought in his way, he said to the wife, "Where's your toilet, dear?" She points to the pail in the lobby.
Nice one. You go there.
Eggs at Arthur Woodman in a hurry.
Go there or go 4 steps.
We had.
Sorry. So thanks everyone. Thanks for listening, and if you've got any questions, I'm here.